I'd like to make a start and just begin by saying that I'm really delighted to be hosting this, hopefully first joint webinar between the Statistical Society of Australia and the Australian Data Science Network. I really do hope we can forge some closer links going forward. And I'd like to welcome everyone here and thank you for joining us today. We've got quite a few registrants, so a really terrific turnout. And I think it reflects there's quite a lot of interest in the topic, and from hearing from our all-star cast of panellists. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of First Nations people today, and I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the webinar today. I'm joining from unceded lands of the Kaurna people, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present around the nation. So as you will have seen, today is World Statistics Day. And it has a theme this year of quality statistics and data for everyone. And we thought data for everyone is an interesting phrase. So that led into thinking about a discussion of data we can trust and why it matters and what's changing as a combining theme for our assembled people from the statistical and data science communities. So it might lead to some thought-provoking discussions across the next hour from a few different perspectives. So we have a great cast of speakers today, and I'm really pleased to be joined by them. I'll briefly introduce them now before they elaborate on their roles. So in alphabetical order, just to be clear, we have Dr. Lucy Farrell, who's the Director of Data Strategy in the Australian Centre for Disease Control Establishment at the Australian Government Department of Health, Disability and Ageing. Also joining us is Associate Professor Kalinda Griffiths, who is a Yawuru woman living and working on Larrakia country. She's an epidemiologist and the Director of the POSH SANT group at Flinders University, and her research focuses on the quality and governance of Indigenous population level data, the improvement of health services and outcomes, and a range of other hats that Kalinda wears as well. We're also joined by Dr. Ben Harrop, who's the Vice President of the Statistical Society of Australia, who works in the Yadura Walani on Mike Y National Study of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Wellbeing at ANU. Ben loves all things data, and I'm sure they'll elaborate on that more in today's panel. Professor Simon Jackman is a leading analyst of public opinion, elections and electoral systems, and based at the University of Sydney. I don't think he has a moonlighting job as an electrician. Some of his recent work centres on machine learning models in the analysis of social media and news. Dr. Sue Kay is Director of the UNSW AI Institute and an expert in robotics, AI and automation. She founded Robotics Australia Group and is a member of the influential Kingston AI Group, and she leads initiatives that translates research into real-world impact. And finally, Dr. Aaron Snoswell is a Senior Research Fellow in AI Accountability at the QUT Generative AI Lab, and his research uses computational and socio-technical approaches to evaluate and better understand the knowledge and behaviour of large language models. So I'm going to now turn to each of the panel members to ask them to talk a little about their role and what does data we can trust mean in their own context. So I'd like to start with you, Aaron Snoswell, and then I'll turn to the other panellists to talk a little bit about that topic.
Thank you, Len, and thanks for the introduction. So as you mentioned that I'm a research fellow that looks at generative artificial intelligence technologies, and in particular how we measure their behaviors. So how do we say how good or how bad an AI system is one of the questions I think about. And in my context, data we can trust, I think, really comes back to the problem of developers of AI models not even telling us the data that they're using. If you look at the big platforms like ChatGPT and the other sort of competing AI services that are out there today, almost none of the developers are disclosing how they are building these tools and the data that they're built on. And because they're data-based technologies, like the data is key, right? Without that, we can't really make all these interesting claims and investigations that we'd like to do into how these systems work. And so data we can trust is data that we can see and that is actually shared as part of good reproducible science.
Thanks, Aaron. Now, Sue, do you have any other insights? And could you tell us a bit more about your role and what data we can trust means in your context?
Yeah, well, I'm with Aaron. I think one of the challenges that we have at the moment is that we don't have a lot of choice in the generative AI tools that we use, but that doesn't, and sometimes people unquestioningly accept that as the reality and as that's the way the world is likely to be in the future. And I would challenge that assumption. And I think the reason that it will change is for the reasons that Aaron has indicated, because we don't know, well, actually, we have got a pretty good idea that these models have currently just been developed on all of the, data slop, that makes up the digital world, right? And in many cases, copyrighted works. There's been no attempt to be able to, rather than actually curate data sets and build AI models for specific purposes, they've collected all of the world's data that they can get their hands on. And then to try and make it acceptable to users, they apply reinforcement learning by humans to try and control any of the outputs that we might find offensive or concerning. And so it's a very imperfect system, but it's been like an arms race as to who can get their hands on the most data. And so to me, in terms of data we can trust, like Aaron, it has to be data that we can see, that we can track back to the original sources, and importantly, that we can have some security in the knowledge that the rights of the creators of that data are being respected. And at the moment, that's just not the world that we live in. But I have hopes that, as this evolves, that will change.
Okay, thank you, Sue, for that elaboration. Simon Jackman, turning to you. Do you have any other insights you might like to add?
Yeah, we'll come back to AI. I've got one or two observations about that, how it crops up in my work later on. But what I'll start with in this intro set is to come back to sort of bread and butter in my world, and that is survey research that I think faces enormous challenges now. Kind of always has, but I think they're especially acute now. That doesn't take away from the fact that we sort of still rely on surveys, incredibly across the social sciences in particular. And by that, I mean anything spanning health right through to politics, education, disability. There's a ton of stuff where the humble survey remains the tool of choice, but it's a tool that faces enormous headwinds as non-response rates go down. The flip side, and what we've always relied on to help rehabilitate surveys, is good data from a census, from government statistical agencies to help calibrate and give us good benchmarks. And so with my former US hat on, I just point to what's happening in the United States at the moment, the erosion of independence of statistical agencies and the data they collect. I know AI can't help but form a big part of the conversation around trust in data at the moment, but I look with dismay at what's happening in the United States with respect to sort of kicking out one of the legs of trust in sort of data infrastructure in democratic societies in particular, that's the independence of government statistical agencies.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, indeed, there's some very concerning turns of event all around the world. Ben Harrop, any other insights from your perspective, a little bit about your role and what data we can trust means to you?
Sure. So yeah, I act as the data manager, data analyst, biostatistician, survey, kind of all-round data person for the MicroEye study. And for me, when I was thinking about this question, thinking about data we can trust is kind of inextricably linked to people that we can trust. And for me, that really comes out in the participants that do continue to participate in the study that we run. We're doing a survey, and like Simon says, surveys for several decades now have been experiencing declining rates of participation. But what I see from the work that we do and what I've been involved in, that building this research study from the ground up based on Indigenous data sovereignty principles and Indigenous data governance has been really interesting to see how doing things, I guess, the right way influences the willingness of people to participate, what kind of information they're willing to share. Because, it's a 16-page long survey. It's pretty long. And it's a big ask to get people to do that. But not only is it the participants that are trusting us with the data, as the data manager, I'm also responsible for providing cleaned, reliable, well-managed data sets to the end users as well. So there's the trust that participants have in us collecting it, the trust that the end users have in me and other people in similar positions to provide them with, I guess, well-managed and cleaned data sets that they can trust to do their research with.
Yeah, good point on that curation importance. Belinda, do you have any other thoughts and introduce us a little bit more broadly to your role as well? Do you mean wear many hats?
Yeah. I'll speak about some of the ones that are quite relevant in our discussions today. Just before I do, though, I will just note I am a Yara woman. My country is in Broome, Western Australia, and I am calling in from the unceded lands of Larrakia people here in Darwin. And I just wanted to pay my respects to all elders, those of the past, the present, and the future. So you noted I am an epidemiologist and I am the director of POSIUS INT at Flinders University. But a couple of other relevant roles for today's discussion include the chair of the longitudinal study for Indigenous children within the Department of Social Services. And this is the longest running national Indigenous cohort study in this country. For those of you who want to use some of that data as well, please get in contact with the DSS and we can have a discussion about that as well. I'm also a member on the National Data Advisory Council, which sits within the Office of the National Data Commissioner within the Department of Finance as well. And we're rolling out some of the data sharing legislation that's occurring across the Australian Public Service nationally. I also navigate a little bit internationally as well, where I'm the co-chair of the International Group for Indigenous Health Measurement, which has been running since the early 2000s. And it's where we discuss and facilitate rights of Indigenous peoples across officials, statistical agencies and support better data and better support data. And I also just wanted to note as well that I'm a member of the newly formed Indigenous Special Interest Group, and this is within the International Statistics Institute. And we were able to formalise this last week at The Hague at the World Statistics Congress. So that's the first time in history that Indigenous voices have been able to be put forward across an international agency such as the ISI. So data we can trust to me is essentially about relationships. It's and we heard about that from Ben just before, and also with purpose, and we heard about that from all of the other speakers in terms of, how do we drive, why are we doing what we're doing, why are we collecting all this information, and importantly, it is about truth telling and rebuilding governance and systems that support mechanisms of Indigenous voices and voices generally, voices of the people. It's about quality and useful data that we can use for nation building and rebuilding as well. And importantly, I think it's about supporting the enactment of human and citizenship rights. And so, it's one of the main reasons why we collect this information is to build our capacity and capabilities as nations and communities as well. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Belinda. Really great range of perspectives there from end user to high up in policy level. Thank you. Lucy Farrell, could I ask you to talk a little bit about your role and what does the theme of data we can trust mean in your context?
Thanks, Lynn. So I'm with the Australian Centre for Disease Control, which will commence as a standalone government entity from the 1st of January 2026, subject to the passage of legislation that's currently before Parliament. So my role as Director of Data Strategy for the Australian CDC has got a broad remit to set the agenda for enhanced and more coordinated and impactful use of data for public health benefit across the new Australian CDC, as well as more broadly across the public health data ecosystem in Australia. The context for establishing an Australian CDC comes off the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we really saw data become central to the narrative about trust in governments and the decisions that are made in the public interest. For example, I'm sure we all remember watching closely for daily updates about the effective reproduction number in various stages of the pandemic, and wondering how our elected leaders would take that evidence to consider lifting lockdowns, and weighing that evidence against a number of competing considerations. So for me, the concept of trust in data is about the integrity of evidence as a basis for decisions, and it's about understanding whose perspectives have been brought to bear in the interpretation and the generation of that evidence.
Thanks, Lucy. That does seem to nicely pick up on some of the other themes that we've heard from the panellists. I'll follow up with another question for you, Lucy, on your perspective on how you think trust in data is changing and what you think is driving this.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the COVID-19 pandemic provides quite a microcosm of broader attitudes towards data across the community. And so it does provide kind of a good model for understanding how trust in data is changing over time. In particular, the COVID-19 response inquiry, which was completed last year by Robin Kruk, AO, Professor Catherine Bennett and Dr. Angela Jackson, looked at the Commonwealth Government's response to the pandemic. And I think really important for today is that trust in data was actually a really foundational part of that report and the findings of the panel. What they found was that there was initially a very high level of public trust in government's decisions during the pandemic, and that was due to the decisions that were being put forward by elected leaders was based on clear and very easily interpreted data. But that trust eroded over time as the complexity of the data that was needed to support government decisions and the methodologies that were being used to analyse the data wasn't available, wasn't transparent, and it wasn't well understood by the public overall. So I think there's a key point to be made there about the increasing complexity of data and analytical methods, and the need to balance technical and scientific rigour in the way that we explain our methodologies and the interpretations that we have of our data with the accessibility of our advice. So transparency isn't just about making our work available, but it's also about explaining it and connecting it with those who need to understand it. I think as well, the degree of public interest in data during the pandemic also speaks to a growing trend in scrutiny around governments. So our elected leaders use data to justify pretty major and restrictive public health interventions like lockdowns and border closures. And those decisions really did impact directly on people's lives. So the public became more invested in understanding how data was being used. So I think that's kind of a key theme, is that increasingly data does things for us. And so it's not just sitting on a shelf, it's in a report, but it's actually being used to make decisions that have got tangible impacts on our lives. And so I think that's kind of part of the trend as to how trust in data is changing.
Yeah.
But I think
Thanks,
also
Lucy.
during...
No, you can continue.
One final point was just that I think as well it's really important to consider changing considerations around privacy as well. So balancing privacy considerations with the utility of data has long been a challenge, but I think that as the complexity of data that we use expands, we have a range of different considerations that we need to bring to bear into those discussions around balancing privacy with utility. And in particular, as we have capacity to translate our interpretation of data differently to different population cohorts, that gives us a range of different kind of considerations as well as to how we balance trust in particular community cohorts with use of their data. Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, Lucy. I was just going to follow up for a different perspective there from Aaron. You talked about sources of data and perhaps our whether we can properly critique where data we're presented with have come from in many larger models. Do you have any different points of view on how trust in data is changing and what's driving it? Is it volume? Is it just the sheer
Lynn.
assault?
I would yeah. Probably my perspective is that there is, I think, overall maybe a decline in trust in perhaps scientific data is how I would frame that, just in terms of like the general public. And I think there's heaps of factors that are contributing to that, if that is a trend. The one that I'm most intimately connected with in my work is maybe the use of artificial intelligence by in academic practice, like actually by researchers and by data scientists and data practitioners, and maybe even the inappropriate use of artificial intelligence tools. is one factor there. I'm currently on a research project that's talking to academics to understand how AI is reshaping our practices as a discipline. And yeah, it's incredibly diverse, but I think, yeah, it's important that people are reflecting on what appropriate and responsible practice looks like in your discipline, however you are working with data, if that's a factor.
Thanks, Aaron. I might turn to a different question now to think about individuals' perspectives. And so, Ben Harrop, what data trust issues do you face in your current work?
So I was thinking about this question, and I feel like what I get to see here is what happens when you do have trust, rather than trust being an issue necessarily, because having the MicroWise study and all of our work kind of be centered around Indigenous data sovereignty and governance first is a really solid principle for us to, I guess, guide how we operate and what we do. And providing, so I mentioned before that the survey that we run, it's a 16-page questionnaire, and on the very back of the questionnaire is a blank page effectively for participants to write whatever they feel like. And it's really incredible seeing all of the different stories that the participants are willing to share with us. And if they didn't have that trust in us as the collectors of the data that they are sharing with us, they wouldn't have written such rich and interesting and diverse stories. And that also gives us, we also have a considerable responsibility to treat that data with the care and respect. So I guess in terms of an issue, we have to, treat that data with care. And one of the things that we try and do is provide, I guess, research summaries and regular reports back to participants, telling them what stories we're able to with the data that we've collected, giving them that sort of feedback loop of, you provided us with some information and collectively this is what we're able to tell you about what you've said. But also there's a level of trust as well around doing something with the data. We heard that just before about actually using the data to do things and advocating for change and positive outcomes for the participants who have participated, but for the communities that are represented either directly or indirectly in the data set that we've got.
Fantastic. Thanks for those insights. And I might pick up on a slightly broader theme with you, Simon, around issues and data trust. Do you think at a slightly broader level, some of the issues stem from technical or ethical or political stances? What's your perception of the public's trust in data?
I think at a really high level, probably political. I think, again, I can't help but draw on the US experience where it's become it's easy for one side of politics, should they choose to go down this path of lumping in statistical agencies as part of sort of this broad ideological critique of sort of, the deep state or the liberal state and its overreach. I think the connection back to COVID that Lucy put on the table is really important. I think that's a key moment where what the administrative state was doing to people and what the technocrats with their data were telling governments to do to people is a real sort of recent watershed moment that perhaps accelerated, I think, some longer term trends. And again, they're most visible in the United States. I think the depth of the COVID response, particularly by the Victorian state government, and the depth of the lockdowns there, you can see it. To this day, Victoria remains, I think, sort of the most up in arms with it, of all the populations around Australia. Sort of the breach of trust, if you will, that's perceived by a lot of people is perhaps most pronounced there. So I think it does go back to a political. It does have a deep at that very, when I open the aperture right up, if I focus down onto sort of my patch in survey research, I think the issues become fundamentally about money, to be honest with you. When I haven't got a big research budget, and either myself or I'm working with different clients, sometimes I'm lucky enough to work on really well-funded projects and sometimes it's a sort of a commercial project, and there isn't a big budget, and my trust in the data I get back when I've had to rely on a quick and dirty data collection method, and there's all sorts of ways I can collect survey data. That's not helpful. I have all sorts of trust questions arise when I've had to work with data from at arm's length. I've just bought the data from a third-party vendor, and there's all the way up the chain you go to where you are very hands-on with designing the study.
Yeah.
You're watching it go out in the field. You're literally got real-time visibility over the data collection from the field, or be it a survey or whatever it might be. And I find my level of trust as a scientist slides up and down depending on where I've landed on that sort of continuum in a given project. I think, and there are two issues to really hit. I think there's the one that I have as a scientist, and then there's just what I see out there in society. And again, I come back to, I think, just what a watershed moment COVID was. And I think, perhaps how much work we might have to do as broadly the scientific community might have to do to offer some reassurance to populations that when as I think it was Lucy said it and Ben said it, Kalinda said it as well. When we're out there asking people to tell us these things about themselves, A, it's for a good reason. B, we're going to protect that, and C, society's going to be a better place if you give us that data and let us do what we do with it. I think reassuring Australian publics, or some in particular perhaps, that's what the game's about, I think is probably a really important thing, perhaps for something for the Statistical Society to put itself at the forefront of.
Yeah, thanks for those points. And yes, I guess your comments were making me think of good, fast, cheap, and how we can think of data on that continuum and its collection and its curation as well. Kalinda, I guess thinking up from there, how should we balance transparency in collection of data and curation of data and trustworthiness in data with confidentiality and cultural sensitivities?
Yeah, I'll build on some of Simon's comments here, because I think it's important to understand where the data sort of sits. Again, it goes back to the purpose that we mentioned earlier on. And within that, depending on who you are and where you sit in society, the purpose of data use may have been very different. So the context for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as an example, is that we've been historically excluded from population estimates. And we know it wasn't until 1967 referendum that the change in Section 127 of the Constitution that allowed for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be included in the National Population Counts occurred. And so, since then, what's happened is we've seen quite incremental growth over that time in terms of population numbers. We've seen an extraordinary rapid growth since the 2006 census, which I just wanted to note, and just highlighting there's been a growth of, it's been an increase of 79% or 78.6, I think it is, and for Indigenous peoples from 2006 to 2021 census. And for non-Indigenous people, there was a 28% increase. And so when we're thinking about, balancing this space, I think it's really important to highlight here that it's not just an issue of data information operations and sharing. It also tells a story about identity recognition, evolution of social attitudes as well, and a story about Indigenous people sort of reasserting visibility within a system that wants to raise us. So handing over that trust back into the system requires us to really consider what transparency means with confidentiality and cultural sensitivity as well. And so I think for us, the balance starts with understanding that transparency doesn't necessarily mean exposure. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data, openness must sit alongside cultural authority. It also needs to sit alongside with, I guess, collective decision-making and collective ownership as well. And there are things that should be shared widely, like census information and information that strengthens our understanding, accountability, equity, stuff like that. But there are also things that are sacred, relational, context specific, which also require the right permissions and governance to be shared appropriately. So we really need to consider that. I just want to note as well, you know, I do speak about rebuilding systems because, you know, historically Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, like I said, have been excluded from these structures and systems. And so now it is about rebuilding, you know, broader systems, particularly within government structures, within research organisations as well, that respect both transparency and self-determination. Data, I think, shouldn't just be available, it should be cared for, and it should be guided by the people for whom it represents and relates to. And so, you know, in practice, this means things like embedding Indigenous governance structures and data decision making. And we heard a bit from Ben how that kind of works with the Micah Y study and you know, the power that that holds. And we've seen it across our programs of work as well, particularly with LSIC. You know, we've had the same people working on the ground, you know, for 20 years now. And that speaks to supporting a process that enables Indigenous voices to be heard. And so, you know, I think it's balancing, you know, ethical and trust with that transparency as well.
Thanks, Kalinda. I think they're very well made points. I want to turn our attention now a little to the future and how emerging technologies might impact data trust. And I thought I'd start with you, Sue Kay. What's your perspective on how emerging technologies might impact trust and what's happening in your space? You're at the forefront, I think, in this arena.
Well, I guess I would say I don't believe there's actually any such thing as data trust in AI at the moment because, you know, really we're expecting the general public to act on blind faith. And we're even applying blind faith in many of the business applications of artificial intelligence. And I'll just unpack that for a moment. When I was in the mining industry, when you were trying to model, you know, how you might be able to, you know, most efficiently extract minerals from the rocks that you've crushed, you know, there's been years and years of people developing physics models to try and explain that physical process and then, you know, be able to make predictions about, you know, if you treat things a certain way, then you're likely to get a certain outcome. And now, since the advent of AI, you know, you can just have this black box that will magically tell you exactly what you should do in terms of your mineral processing to get the result that you want. And no one understands how it works. No one can explain it. It doesn't relate back to the physics-based models, but it works. You know, and so it's economically rational to then just go with whatever the AI says. And so, you know, the separation between the outputs of AI models and the data on which they trained, you know, is vast. And no one has a good ability to really track back and understand what it is about that data that is causing the models to have, in many cases, as I said, you know, very economically rational results that you'd be crazy not to base decisions on. However, I think, you know, the advent of generative AI like ChatGPT has had its good sides and its bad sides. So on the one hand, it has given, you know, anyone with an internet access the ability to actually experiment for themselves with an AI, which, you know, previously was really impossible for, you know, any member of the general public to do. However, the downside is that I think that, you know, particularly when these generative AI, you know, tools produce results that, you know, don't meet with people's expectations, you know, then there is an erosion of trust. And I think that kind of then links into, you know, the whole issue of trust in data. But I think back to the original question that you started off with, I mean, a lot of this really goes to who do you consider to be your sources of truth? And I would argue at the moment, you know, not to sound too paranoid about it, but that a lot of people are becoming increasingly suspicious about big tech and the models that are currently available to us. and whether we should have trust in those. And I think those are, you know, really important questions to have. I guess what we don't have is a great alternative at the moment.
Yeah.
But I do believe that that is happening. Unfortunately, though, we're being asked to make rapid decisions about things in the absence of all of the information, in the absence of having, I mean, we talk about AI literacy. I mean, you know, I'm sure, you know, there's been discussions for years about data literacy. AI literacy just kind of adds the complexity, you know, up another notch. And Australians have the greatest fear of AI of any population in the world. I guess you can look at that two ways. In some ways, that's a good thing. I think it's good that people should be skeptical and they should be asking questions. But we're under so much pressure to adopt these technologies, not only in our personal lives, but in our businesses. And I think that fundamentally, the way that, you know, the people who are currently controlling these AI models behave as organizations will have huge influence on the way that people trust not only these models, but potentially the data, not that it's traceable, on which they're built.
So I might just follow up on that point, Aaron. So as collectively, as a community of professionals in this space, so the contrast between technologies and the information we're deriving from them, how can we ensure that technologies help to build trust rather than undermine trust?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. The first one might surprise you a little bit, but I think actually being brave enough to call out bad behavior when we see it is maybe one part of that solution. And so, for instance, I'm thinking about, there's an article I saw in the news just this weekend gone talking about the broad scale use of artificial intelligence in by certain groups submitting submissions to the government, and perhaps inappropriate use of artificial intelligence. And so being brave enough to actually call out when you see inappropriate use that could actually lead to erosion of trust in data and in institutions, I think, is one factor. The other point I want to pick up on what Sue said actually is, like Sue mentioned, we're under enormous pressure and often time pressure. Like there's almost
Yes.
like an acceleration. And I think a big part of that is good science takes time. It's not something that can be rushed. And so being prepared to actually take your time to do good quality work with data is actually critical. Like it takes a long time to go through and actually analyze, to develop fit models, to actually then interpret that faithfully and sort of think through the assumptions and the implications, and then to even translate that to different audiences, as some of our panelists have said. And so, yeah, pushing back on the rush and the need to always sort of be hustling is not the right word, but yeah, to actually take the time to do good quality work, I think, is another key thing that we can all be doing as a community.
Yeah, there's some thumbs up and love hearts coming from the audience at that point. And I think Sue absolutely nailed it when we think about the black box approach that I think many of us are feeling is becoming sort of almost endemic. Lucy, from a data strategy point of view, how can we make sure that emerging technologies get used well and optimally to help build trust in what we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to the point that's been well made already, that when we're using data, we're doing it to achieve a particular outcome and a particular benefit for the community. And so I think using that as a framework for understanding where we can apply new technologies and when it's not appropriate is kind of a foundational bedrock for considering how we can apply these types of technologies. That then gives us a good scope of the risks that might manifest in putting new technologies out into the world, and gives us a framework to assess those risks. So, you know, it's about being alert to the benefits that can be realised through new technologies, but also the harms.
Yeah, and so I think that point around harms and thinking about the safeguards, or the sort of term du jour of guardrails, but how we can ensure that we do have some capacity to put the brakes on if it's needed.
Yeah.
Simon,
and I think
no, go on, Lucy.
Sorry, Lynn. I was just going to also say that it's really important that we also engage with the community about their expectations for using new technologies, particularly when we are working with population level data sets where people are represented in the data. It's important that people have a say in the development and application of technologies, and can express to the people that are using their data what their bounds of comfort are. That's really important to give us a sense of how we can communicate what we're doing in ways that connect with the community and their way of understanding, and helps us to better understand some of the risks that might not be on our radar, working in our kind of sphere of expertise.
Yeah, and I think that transcends sort of population health, but also some of our other population level across whole of government. Yeah, well made points. Simon Jackman, so coming back to the idea around safeguards, and what from your point of view should we promote to ensure that AI models are auditable?
Oh, it's so hard. Look, just so I've been a scientist my entire adult life, right? And I'm old enough to remember when this thing called the internet came along, and data was something that arrived over, stopped being something that arrived on a tape that you had to take to a building on the other side of campus or something. But what we are living through right now is like nothing I've ever seen. 6 months is a long time at the moment with the pace of technological innovation, and this thing about slowing down. Well, I wish, but that's not what's happening in this space. I mean, it's GPT-3 went to 3 to 4 to 5. You blink and we're down the road to another LLM. For all the sort of things about slowing down, I got to say, I've become a so much more productive scientist by having 3 of these LLMs open as my coding research assistant. The amount of work I can get through, right? And it wants to help me with the write-up too, and that's where I'll tap the brakes. But I just want to say there's an awful lot, I think, of good, and to accomplish some of these scientific and ethically valid aims, there's actually an awful lot of good in. I just know my working day just looks so much more different, and it's actually so much more productive. As a result, that said, I think we've got to be very alert to the downside. Auditing is just so hard, because so many of the auditing recommendations will say something like, "Oh, carefully inspect the data used to train the model." Like, what? Like, are you real? Like, that is just an impossible ask when it's like, it's a X billion or trillion parameter LLM that's been trained on everything ever written and everything discoverable on the internet.
Yeah.
I'll give you one little example from my own work. So a research project where ahead of the, we did a 1-month audit of Australian media, and we were really interested in the gender mix of which women journalists are being asked to work on what sort of stories, or women's voices are more likely to appear in what sort of stories. So fundamentally, we've got about 350,000 news articles, and it's a zero-shot classification problem. What's the topic, and can you recognize a woman speaker either in the byline or in the body of the article? First go at that was 18 months ago with ChatGPT-3, and the model really struggled with Australian idioms and what was in the news in Australia. You come back and we replicated the study with ChatGPT-5. And it's on rails. It's since been trained on and has discovered a lot of the content that hadn't been in its training window.
Yeah.
Right. So even that is like, oh, I'm going to make a different conclusion with the same data, right? So one of the standards of scientific objectivity is replicability. Yeah. And no, like the same data fed to an LLM, only 12 to 18 months more mature, produced A, way better results, more accurate, and B, faster, and was starting to discover more nuance in the data. And so this idea, I just think there's a little example of just like, we are riding the back of we're in the middle of a whirlwind at the moment, and like trying to tap the brakes and impose standards when the people making these things are competing with one another, again, at a level that I've never seen in my professional life. I think we're in a really tricky moment.
It's an interesting time, isn't it?
It is.
Sure
So
is.
I'll leave it at that. I wish I had a more, just sharing that insight. I wish I had something more positive to share on this, but and maybe the experts from AI on the call have something more positive to contribute.
Well, Sue, do you have any other thoughts on what safeguards we should promote to ensure that models that we generate with AI can be audited given the rapidity of change. And so again, point in time, it's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the end of the day, they have to be built to be auditable. And so increasingly companies are looking to build their own AI models, and that would give them the auditability. What we're seeing in Europe, thanks to the EU AI Act, is a whole category of new business around AI assurance, which may not help to make models auditable, but would at least help to test the models and ensure that, hopefully reduce the potential harm that the models may be able to cause. But one thing I'd like to point out to, our audience, if they're not already aware of this, is that even the AI research field has been hijacked by big tech. And so this is very different to any other discipline. And so if you look at the people who are publishing the most papers around advances in AI, it is people from Google's DeepMind. It is people from all sorts of places, not universities. And so I think that actually also introduces an element of risk that we haven't seen before in any other scientific discipline, because the types of papers and the types of research that are being conducted in AI, the type of AI research that is getting funding, is very much not controlled by academia anymore. And so I think people really have to be aware of that, because there is the kind of prevailing view of how things are and potentially how they might be in the future, which is very much a narrative controlled by companies that have commercial interests rather than academia. And I think there's a lot more we could be doing at, potentially collaborating with, maybe the middle powers, to have a look at what agency we can have so that we can have and be building more AI models that we can rely on, so that we can let go of a lot of the reliance on, these big God models, with all of the inherent risks that they have. And one, I guess, element of hope that I have is, we've got mandatory sustainability reporting here in Australia for our large companies that started in January. And, this is a sustainability issue. If you are building AI models within a company, particularly if it's being incorporated in products that you're selling to people, and you can't answer questions about the auditability of the data, and you can't actually reassure people that the creators of the original works on which those AI models have been built, that it's not built on stolen data, I think eventually companies will find that it is more in their best interests to be working on a whole bunch of smaller models that perhaps we managed to piece together to compete with these God models. But we're not there yet. And I think it will take some time to get there. But I think there is going to be a commercial imperative to look at what alternatives might be available.
Thanks, Sue. Again, some thumbs up coming from the audience, so really well made points. I want to switch focus back to communities when we're thinking about communication, and I was going to go to you, Kalinda, to think about how Indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty reshape our concept of trustworthy data. So I know that Sue's talked about sort of the business imperative and how we're going to see that open up. What things might drive how we incorporate knowledges into trustworthiness in data?
Yeah, Indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty really does reframe what it means for data to be trustworthy. I think it shifts the question from, is this data accurate and usable, which are really important things, to, is it accountable, is it relational, and is it governed by those it represents? And, one of the focus areas that we've seen is around how do things like citizenship science and those approaches, what roles do they play in building accountability mechanisms and structures to support trust in data as we kind of move forward in this very fast-paced space that we're engaging in. So I think trustworthy data is not just technically robust, it's relevant. And for Indigenous peoples, it is about respecting our worldviews, where our knowledge is held collectively, you know, the relational aspect of it as well, and it's bound to those responsibilities to country and community. So if you kind of get those processes right, and we are trying to work through some of those stewardship approaches and governance approaches that can support, you know, ways in which we make some decisions about data. If we can get that right for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous peoples, it can get right for everyone as well. And so as an example, I have a centre up here in Darwin that I co-lead, the Ramatjodi Training Centre, where we have young people come, and essentially at the start of the program, we kind of sat around and said, well, who's going to be on the steering committee? And I was like, well, we're representing young people. Okay, well, representing young people, should young people have a voice? Well, of course they should. And so essentially we then developed up a youth advisory group. Youth advisory group has a mechanism to feed into the steering committee. They then have a determination around some decisions that are made. We've now, off the back of their engagement, we've done an evaluation process. We now have done a cohort study with that group as well. And so within that, you know, these are determined by the people that it's representing, and it's going to help support, build their work and the way in which they do things in the future. And so again, it's determining how their data is interpreted, and it's also shared as well. And I think, you know, this really changes the dynamic, because trust isn't assumed. It's built through relationship, that transparency, that, you know, ongoing care that we kind of have there. And you know, for us, when we govern our own data, the foundation of trust changes. I think Sue mentioned before, it's about whose trust are we speaking about? You know, it's no longer about, you know, trust in those systems where trust has been built on, you know, whatever that's perceived to be. You know, it's about confidence in our governance, the way that we run things, our laws, our ethics, our decision-making processes that kind of sit within there. So I think for Indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty, it isn't just about that sort of, those things don't just reshape data, they also build, I guess, accountable and appropriate data, usable data for community use as well. And you know, importantly, I think it reminds us that trustworthy data isn't something that's built in isolation. It's not something that's independent. It's something that's maintained through these partnerships, relationships. Yeah. You know, the systems that we set up.
Systems approaches, together. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Kalinda. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, and so I'm just going to call on each of our panelists. It's been a fantastic discussion today. I've learned so much from each of you. A quick round from each of you. Sue Kay, I'll start with you. What's one practical step we can take to strengthen trust in data over the next 5 years?
I think holding organisations to account to, you know, their ESG principles is a good start, and that should include organisations being clear about the AI models that they're using, and you know, the sustainability issues around those, not just in the environmental issues, but the issues around you know, whether they're sourced from essentially stolen data, and also the implications from the Modern Slavery Act, which all of our corporations you know, are supposed to abide by, because you know, if you trace back a lot of these AI models, you know, it seems very clear that they are in breach of the Modern Slavery Act as well in the way they do their reinforcement learning.
Yes, there's some not such great practices abounding everywhere, aren't there? Lucy, reflections from you on how we can, I guess, from a government perspective, strengthen trust in
look,
data.
I think Within government, we've got a range of high-level frameworks to support our and use of data, in particular the Australian Government Data Governance Framework that sits in the Department of Finance, as well as the APS-wide Framework for Governance of Indigenous Data developed by the National Indigenous Australians Agency. So those are two high-level frameworks that give us kind of a beacon for how to develop effective data governance frameworks. But I'm really struck with some of the comments made by Kalinda around ensuring that data isn't just available, it's cared for, and that it's stewarded by those who are represented in the data. So I think that's something to consider for me in my role, how we go through translating those frameworks into operational practices and how we can ensure that the people that are represented in data have a say in how it's used.
Thank you, Lucy. And Ben, I think following up on some of those points, your use of the MyKawai survey data are really relevant here. So what's a practical step from your perspective that we can take to strengthen trust in data?
Well, I think a lot of the commentary today has really highlighted the fact that humans need to be a lot more present and involved in the collection and usage of data. And an example of this that I was thinking about, I think this already happens in the UK, it might even be a requirement for clinical trials, is that there are public representatives on the research committee for that study who are not technical experts, they're just members of the public who are in some way represented by the research that is being conducted. And I think that's just really important to have those opinions present in, again, the way that we're designing and collecting information, but also having qualitative research be a part of, research studies that we're doing, or having the human impacts of decisions being made with data much more present in the minds of decision makers. And that comes from having the people who are potentially impacted being able to tell their stories.
Thanks, Ben. I agree. We need that synergy is going to improve all round. Simon, some thoughts from you on this quick reflection on strengthening trust in data.
I'll put the AI stuff to one side. I just want to come back to the theme about people. Scientists are people. These issues about data trust are particularly acute when we as people study other people. Australia, I think, has a really good story to tell with human subject protections. My experience back in Australia is that it is, world's best. Certainly in universities, research ethics review panels are incredibly rigorous and incredibly mindful. I think there's a really great culture of bringing science, young researchers sort of get how the awesome responsibility you sometimes carry when you start to do human subjects research. I think we've got a great story to tell. But that is not set and forget. That needs constant reinforcement. And the other thing I say is just money makes a big difference. And this is perhaps a message to government. Good science not only takes time, but it takes money. And to get all these pieces right, if you start asking people to do it quick and dirty, then ethical and data protection start to slide away. Right now, we've got a pretty great world. In Australia, your data is more likely to get exfiltrated, expropriated from a financial institution or an airline than it is from an academic study or a government statistical agency. Long may it be that case, but that takes money.
Yeah. Aaron, some closing thought from you on a practical step we can take.
Yeah, as data practitioners, I think we need to continue telling data stories that are faithful to the data, which, includes slowing down where needed to do good science and acknowledging uncertainty where there's uncertainty. There aren't always clear answers, and we need to be clear about that.
Yeah, great point. And Kalinda, final word to you on that topic around what we can do to ensure that we do better.
Embedding appropriate governance across all levels of data systems, from design, collection through to analysis, access and use. I think investment, fiscal investment and political will to make those processes and structures permanent as well. And, I think for Indigenous peoples. If Indigenous governance becomes standard practice and it's not the exception, then we'll see data that's more accurate, more ethical, more meaningful. And that's how we strengthen trust. It shifts from systems that manage Indigenous data and peoples to systems that are co-governed and designed with Indigenous peoples. And I'll just say happy World Statistics Day as well. So woo woo.
Thanks so much. Thank you all. And I really want to finish by thanking all of our fantastic panellists for great reflections and insights and their experiences and thoughts that they've shared so readily today. We've covered a lot of ground in 60 minutes. I also want to thank Tim McCougar and the Statistical Society of Australia team for supporting today's event and promoting it across different platforms. And just a shameless plug at the end, we're always pretty keen in the Statistical Society to support more members of the statistical and data science communities. And we have loads of networking events like today's opportunities at branches and at national events. We have a really active early career and student statistician network. So a good plug, please consider joining us if you haven't, but also recognise both the ADSN and the Statistical Society of Australia have their meetings within the next sort of 6 weeks. So there's good opportunities to network with others and hopefully continue some of the discussions around the importance of trust in data. So thanks for the session. Sorry, we've gone a couple of minutes over, but I really hope we can build on the existing synergies between SSA and ADSN. And happy World Statistics Day again to everyone. So I hope you go forth and do something useful and interesting with the rest of your day. Thanks all.